Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, 24th of September, with the second part of the roundtable discussion on energy.
Actually, on a whole, net contributing to the market. So the rhetoric we've seen and the policy targeting LNG exporters is, in our view, a little misplaced. It's poor policy, but it is good politics because, let's face it, big gas exporters are not particularly popular amongst the public.
Right. Tony, would you agree with this, that it's not all on the LNG's blame?
Look, I think, again, that's absolutely true, as many of these things are we're speaking about. The LNG companies would say, look, when we were building up our export volumes, we anticipated that we'd continue to explore for gas in Australia to effectively make sure that we did have enough gas for domestic supply, and they would argue that the constraints on gas development, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, but maybe other states will come as well, have actually made that much more difficult for them to meet that domestic demand. And of course, so gas has been a significant contributor. I absolutely agree that gas prices would gradually have moved up anyway. What's happened, two or three things have come together again nastily. One is that they've moved up much more quickly because of the rapid adjustment to a huge increase in volume of gas production and therefore exports on the East Coast. And it takes a while for supply to gradually catch up with that issue. Secondly, has been the fact that gas, just at the time when gas would have been the solution to both reducing emissions from coal-fired power stations and also being the backup when more wind and solar are being used, just at that same time, gas is also very expensive for electricity production, and gas itself has been one of the major contributors to the increase in electricity prices. So again, it's sort of a nasty combination of contributing issues, all at the almost at the worst possible time.
There's been a lot of talk too that perhaps we should start tapping on other gas fields as well. Rosemary, would you agree with that, or do you think we should really be finding our way away from gas?
Look, I think there's certainly, Fauzi, a need to improve gas supply. And we're looking at a range of really quite unexpected mechanisms to do that. But the core message from households and businesses is that there ought to be enough gas in Australia for Australian purposes. And I think through the lens of the long-term interests of consumers, if people had really had that as their focus in a range of decisions over the last 10 years, we wouldn't be where we are now. But the consumers have come knocking. It's time to sort this out, and it's got to be sorted out through the interests of consumers, households and businesses in Australia.
Well, let's move on now from all traditional energy sources, and let's talk about renewables here. Tony, wind and solar energy are in the mix as an alternative resources. Will this mix be enough to serve the needs of a growing population, or is it still a case of having to rely on coal and gas and then using renewables as a backup?
Well, in some ways the words renewables can be both helpful and unhelpful. It's helpful because it just groups some technologies together, but what it does sometimes can take the focus away from what's really important, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, wind and solar have that significant advantage, but also so does hydro, so do other forms of solar energy, and so does nuclear. And so, when we focus more on what the actual problem is, which is less greenhouse gas emissions, and less on the technologies, then we can see a lot more clearly what's going on. Because the trick with wind and solar, and Saul referred to this earlier, is that they are intermittent. And as we've increased the percentage of wind and solar in our system, particularly wind, and in one case in South Australia, the lack of focus on how do we integrate intermittent supply. I'm not against renewables, it's absolutely essential that we move towards wind and solar as well as other things, but as we do that, we absolutely have to integrate that into our system, otherwise there will be problems. And it was the failure to integrate high levels of wind into our system that contributed to a lot of the concerns we have today, and are absolutely essential as we move forward. So yes, wind and solar will almost inevitably be part of our future energy supply mix. But dealing with the intermittency, and that means things like storage will be part of the what's needed to get the right mix into the future.
So do you think that integration of green energy resources should really be more of the focus now as we try to move or we try to move away from old traditional sources of energy?
That was almost the overwhelm.
Well, I think that's where we are already. And the challenge is actually the details of working that out. Now, as Tony says, the outlook for renewables in Australia is very positive, and it's a question of when, not if, we've become a predominantly renewables sourced energy system across the east coast of Australia. The real issue is our transition there, and are we going to get there with or without compromising our energy security? And to date, we have compromised our energy security, and it's very important to remember that we've taken our energy security for granted for a very long time in Australia. But when it is compromised, like we saw last year in South Australia, for example, there's a very real economic cost. There's a very real human cost. I think we saw, for example, an IVF clinic lost its power, and it was devastating. There were embryos lost. And so there's an economic and a human cost involved here. And what we have with the rise of renewables into the grid, and South Australia is almost world leading here in the degree of renewables that has moved into the penetration grid, is that storage solution to deal with the intermittency. Now, at the moment, if you want to look at, how do you solve that? Gas is one potential option, but again, prices there are rising. And secondly, you've got other storage options such as batteries. But unfortunately, batteries are even more expensive at this time. Now, as the trend continues, you'll see batteries starting to compete in 10 or so years. But we're not there yet. And as you have policy which is increasing your intermittent power generation without having the market mechanisms and the investment to deal with that intermittency, energy security is going to continue to be compromised. And we're seeing now the AEMO talking about the development of a capacity market and so on to deal with this, but we still haven't got those details borne out yet, and that's why it's such a challenge.
And it's a conversation that I suppose will continue until some sort of a solution is found. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the discussion there at the Sunday Roundtable. Thank you to my guest, Tony Wood, the Director of the Grattan Institute's Energy Program, Saul Kavanagh, and analyst with the global company Wood Mackenzie, Rose Sinclair, CEO of Energy Consumers Australia. And thank you for joining me, Fawzia Ibrahim, on Sunday.
Yeah, well, I reckon they're dreaming. I think the problem is that everybody who's alive today has pretty much grown up taking all the infrastructure for granted. There's not too many people today who grew up on kerosene lamps. Not here in Australia, there's not. I mean, my kids did. I think they were probably about 9 and 10 when I got my first solar panel. So most people don't understand how little electricity you can get by on. Most people don't understand how much electricity the average Australian squanders, just throws away. Most people don't understand the compound inefficiencies involved in lighting a fire to boil water, to blow steam on a turbine, to spin a wheel covered with magnets so that you can excite electrons in a wire and then send the excited electrons tens, hundreds, thousands of miles to where somebody wants to do something with the energy and they want the energy released to be thousands of miles away from where they lit the fire. There was an item in a New Scientist magazine once where they worked out the thermal efficiency of building a railway line, building a train, putting the coal on the train and carrying the coal to where you want the energy released to be, compared to lighting the fire and putting the electricity into a wire and sending the power wherever you want it via electrical transmission. And it turns out that the critical distance is 40 kilometres, 28 miles. And if you want the energy release to be any more than 28 miles or 40 kilometres from where your power station is, it is more efficient to build a railway line and carry the coal and light it when you get to where the energy needs to be used. Yet here in Australia, we have this thing they call the grid, which enables people in Tasmania to sell electricity to people in Adelaide. It allows people in Melbourne to sell electricity to people in far north Queensland. Because the people in far north Queensland have got an electricity smelter, and the people in Victoria had a brown coal-fired power station where you have to actually cook the fuel in the waste flue gases to drive the moisture out of it before you can put it on the conveyor belt and stick it into the furnace. And it's very difficult to change the throttle setting. So what they wanted to do was run the coal-fired power station 100% output at its most thermally efficient setting and never change the throttle and just send the power it makes off somewhere. So there are people who spend thousands of dollars per week on electricity in their small business. You go into a little corner store where such things still exist, and you'll find a building that has no thermal insulation in the roof, no thermal insulation in the walls. On a hot day, it's basically a solar oven, and inside that solar oven, they have a couple of glass-fronted large cabinet display refrigerators, and those things are connected to a coal-fired power station 300 miles away, 400 miles away. And to keep the cans of drink and the pats of butter and stuff on sale cold, they're pumping heat out of the cabinet, and then the heat exchangers dumping it into the bloody solar oven that the little corner store operator is sitting in. It never occurs to them to put the heat exchanger outside on the shady side of the building so that they're not constantly dumping more heat into the room they're sitting in. I don't think the fact that the commercial world has become used to using prodigious quantities of electricity and getting it almost for nothing is going to influence the fact that we have to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere. Theoretically, we've only had 1 degree of global warming. Last winter in Australia was 2 degrees above average winter. How many of the people in Texas and Louisiana and Alabama and Georgia and Florida who've become homeless and unemployed, how many of them are going to be contributing to the American economy and making America great again? I think they're going to be flat out getting through their day's activities to have enough water and food for the next day. I think the economy's, quote, needs are actually wants. And I think everybody's going to have to get used to using a whole lot less electricity because we can't afford to put the carbon into the air that it takes to generate the electricity. There's not enough mountains with lakes at the top of them. To make enough hydroelectricity to boil enough water to make 1 cup of coffee, you have to drop about 170 litres of water down 350 metres of mountain. And with global warming, we're getting patchy rainfall and the lake on top of your mountain may be dry anyway. Our politicians are talking about fixing everything with adding a new pump storage scheme to the Snowy Mountains. Pump storage just means you run your coal-fired power station all night, pump water uphill, and when the little darlings turn on their hairdryer and their toaster in the morning, you run the water back down and you generate some electricity with it. They're living in cloud cuckoo land. They're not grasping the fact that humanity has to cut back on its consumption, has to cut back on its pollution generation. Life's about to get interesting. Warble's on a lot to YouTube. We're on the upload limit. Ciao. Actually, I looked at the counter wrong. We've got about another minute. Once upon a time, I thought I was going to be able to build a windmill that was as cost efficient as a solar panel. And the windmills got to be more difficult and more expensive to build than I thought, and the solar panels got to be cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Battery storage is an issue, but the price of batteries has been coming down too. I think the answer is to have a solar panel and a windmill. In my case, I hope to have a solar thermal wood gas generator. Spread your energy requirement across various sources and use as little of everything as possible. Just use less. It's not a difficult message to understand. It's just not really palatable to somebody who wants to continue to squander energy everywhere. They don't want to make a 180-degree change in direction. My windmill is more manoeuvrable than their mind. Baubles on a lot to YouTube. Second time. Ciao.